Podcast. I'm your host, Uzamantungwa Khumalo. It's a Tuesday edition of the Private Property Podcast. And before we start our conversation this evening, we want to first acknowledge, the activity of the past few days in South Africa. As many of you who are regular viewers of the show know, we didn't go on air yesterday. And part of why we didn't go on air yesterday was because we saw the mood in the country. We saw the state of where everybody was at. If anything, yesterday was quite a heavy day for many who are affected by, the looting that we're seeing in our various communities. And many of us are also consuming what is happening. We all know somebody who might know somebody who's been affected. And I think the collective grief also, when we look at the loss that many of us have experienced, particularly during this third wave. And so we want to take a moment to pause, to regroup and not have a conversation about property and property investments. And now, as we slowly try to gather ourselves, try to make sense of things, but also try to plan as best as possible. Because part of living in crisis, as we saw last year when we came live in the middle of a crisis, a very unprecedented one, was that we also want to work on the solution together. And that's exactly what we do as a community here on Private Property, and of course in the Private Property Podcast, that we try to find different ways of working through the crisis that we're finding ourselves in. And in as much as we talk about property, the reality is the properties that we often talk about are also our homes. And we cannot negate that we live in these spaces and so many things happen in our homes. And so we wanted yesterday to take that break, acknowledge what was happening in the country before we come back on air. And as we come back on air, the first conversation that we want to have is around something that many of us are very likely going to have to deal with. And that is around rental relief. And this was one of the first this was actually the first conversation that we had on the show over a year ago, where we were looking at us going into 21 days of lockdown, already preempting that there are going to be economic effects of the lockdown and how tenants and landlords need to be having a proactive conversation together in order to come up with solutions to weather the storm. This has been a very long storm, especially because we thought we were going to only be 21 days into a lockdown. It's probably the longest 21 days many of us have experienced. And now we're essentially in the middle of another storm, and potentially even a bigger storm. I think the violence, along with the third wave of COVID-19, and of course the economic effects, means that yet again, we have to be proactive, both as tenants and landlords, and even as families, because this is also one of those instances where perhaps you might change living arrangements as a family, but how do we become proactive in weathering this particular storm together? And that's exactly what we're going to be focusing on this evening in particular, and also for the next couple of days, because we recognize that we're trying to make sense of something that is very unprecedented. We're trying to navigate something that is very heavy, not just emotionally, but psychologically and also physically. And of course, the unfortunate thing is that there's also an expectation that life has to continue. And so we thank you for all the messages that you sent to us yesterday. I saw on Facebook, I saw also on my page, a lot of the top fan gang members also commenting. And we really did want to acknowledge that there was something or a moment that was happening in the country yesterday. And that's why we also wanted to pause a little bit, as opposed to continue as though it's business as usual. And this evening, as we look at rental relief and go back to the conversation that we started when we had the first episode of the show, we're going to be looking at what, on the landlord side, how you ought to be proactive in having a conversation with your tenants right now. Some of your tenants may be affected by, certainly by the third wave, by business activity being stopped during this period or halted. Because we've seen quite a number of businesses preemptively not opening up, particularly today because of the violence that we've seen in different parts of the country. So how are you as a landlord already being proactive in communication with your tenants? There's a WhatsApp group. There are a few WhatsApp groups that I'm in that are property related. One of them is landlords, and there was a landlord who was sharing that he already sent a message that said, try and get your electricity vouchers try and get your water vouchers, because we don't know what movement is going to be like. If you have a car, try and fill up. And he was just being proactive to his tenants, because he knows that he's put prepaid meters in their particular properties. He was already urging his tenants to just stay safe and stay in the house as much as possible. He's kitted the house with, with fiber and all kinds of amenities. And then on the other hand, we'll also be looking at, if you're a tenant, you're also realizing that you're potentially going to find yourself in a very difficult position when it comes to making rent. How can you proactively already start the conversation with your landlord now, especially given that it's the 13th of July. It's relatively early. I mean, rent is due, is not due for another 2.5 weeks. So is this something that you can preemptively already just start having a conversation now, see whether things will get better? And if not, what can you put in place with your tenant? That's what we can look forward to this evening. I want to find out from you at home, if you're a tenant, are you already in that kind of position where you can see that you potentially may struggle with rent, whether it's this month or the following month? And on the landlord side, what plans are you putting in place to be able to have that conversation with your landlords and with your tenants, especially if you did do so when we started off with this lockdown? But before we get started with our conversation this evening, I love talking about the other shows that we have across Private Properties social media pages. As it is a Tuesday, you can catch award-winning farmer Umbalini on the Farming Podcast later on this evening at 8 p.m. And she also comes to your screens every single Thursday at the same time. As actually, I've been talking about starting my veggie garden at home, and I was seeing somebody who had said that they've already started, working on their garden at home, because I think we're like 6 weeks away from spring. So they're already tending to it so that they get ready to essentially plant, when it's springtime. So I'm also getting on that bandwagon in between, construction work at the house. So I'll definitely be documenting that on social media. You can follow me on @Zamandunga_K. And of course, every Wednesday, so that's tomorrow evening, you can catch ST Klassen on the First Time Home Buyers Show, which is always in conversation with people who have not only walked that first time home buying journey, but have gone on to grow their property portfolios from strength to strength. And every Mondays and Fridays, you can catch Chad on the Home Shoppers Show, where always gives us a great snapshot of what you can expect in some of the amazing properties that you find on www.privateproperty.co.za. And those are the great programs that you can catch every single weekday at 8 p.m. across our social media pages. So do make sure you follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube. And we're now also on TikTok. You can see Esty as well as Chad bringing you really great videos when it comes to TikTok. I'll admit, I'm still not clued up with TikTok much. I'm on Instagram. So Instagram I'm really great at. And I'd rather do Reels than TikTok. I find TikTok has too many things going on. So you certainly can catch them bringing you really great TikTok content. But to get us started with our conversation this evening, as I said, I want to hear from you at home how you're going to be navigating, or how you're already preemptively navigating rental relief right now. I remember sharing earlier in the podcast, this was of course when we started off the podcast, that when we went into that 21-day lockdown, I actually reached out to all of my tenants and I gave them, I think it was a 10 or 15% off on the rental. I can't remember the percentage. And it wasn't I'm giving you this, percentage off for you to pay off at a later stage. It was, whether you're affected by the lockdown or not affected, this is the reduction. You don't have to pay it back. It's for the 3-month period. In the event where you're not affected by COVID, you can pass it forward to somebody else that you may know, because the reality is also that many of us probably know a loved one who would probably need that little bit extra. So I said you can give it to them, but this is not something that you need to pay back or have a payment arrangement on. And I know many of you at home shared that you had similar things in place for your tenants, especially for those first 3 months. Others chose to use it. Others chose to sort of, have it pile up so that in that 3 months, by the 4th month they pay, then rental will be slightly less. So there've really been different mechanisms that we've, used as landlords to make life easier and better for our tenants, who ultimately are our customers. So it's also about finding different ways to work with our customers. Now, in terms of helping us navigate, both sides, from tenants as well as the landlord side, this evening we've got somebody who needs no introduction, one of our very regular guests, Nthato Raboshaga, who is the owner at Nthato Realty. Nthato, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
So, bona makhumalo njani?
Ngisaphila njani Nthato?
Siyaphila.
Hey, mawukhuluma isiZulu yangithusa phela ngoba wena isiZulu sakho siso. That's I'm like, hey, kwenzakalani la? What is this man trying to do?
I'm
is
trying.
Is he trying to sell me a house? Is he trying, like, what is he trying to sell me a house or a building? What's happening here?
Then I'm selling you a house.
I feel like that it's my sweet spot. So it's just like, if I want to sell a building, then I can be like, listen, I know you're in the market for a building. Yes, a building. But we're not talking about that. Before we add a building to my portfolio, the reality of where we're finding ourselves right now in Nthato is that a lot of tenants are going to be under strain when it comes to making rent. We're already seeing this. And I mean, at some stage, we'll probably look at the effects that this has had on the retail sector, probably next week on the show. But tonight, we're obviously focusing on the residential side and the effect that this is going to have on residential tenants. And not just, the third wave, which we were already seeing is having, quite a devastating economic effect. I think one of the things that we're seeing with the violence and people's jobs being affected by, the damage, but also because certain businesses preemptively closed. I mean, today I went out for a bit and I saw quite a number of different businesses in areas that, there's no violence, but they, as a precautionary measure, closed their doors today, and yesterday had closed early. Potentially we might wake up tomorrow and they're also closed. So there's a possibility of no economic activity in a lot of those businesses for this week. And a lot of those jobs, unfortunately, are such that people need to be at work in order to earn their living. From the landlord side, I think I want to start with the landlord because I think there's a bigger responsibility from the landlord side. And for the most part, some of them are in a slightly better off position to initiate this conversation. What should landlords be preemptively doing right now before it gets to, the 1st of next month and you're now having to send letters of demand? Because that should never be our starting point, especially when we're looking at what is happening and we're monitoring also on social media. What can a good landlord preemptively be doing right now when it comes to engaging with their tenant or tenants when it comes to potential rental relief?
Yeah, I think the first thing that the landlords need to do is to be proactive. Talk to your tenants, open that line of communication, which is very important. And most tenants are actually afraid to reach out to the landlord. So if you're the one who's starting out the conversation, it may be easier for your tenants to actually talk to you. But what I've found to be helping us mostly is just, set an appointment and talk to them via phone. I've seen that emails and WhatsApp are actually deaf when it comes to the tonality. So it's important for one to read the room and understand that whatever you're sending across, even an email, they may not land that well. So the first thing that you do is reach out, have a conversation, and try to find out, more like sussing out, to say, listen, what do you think will happen? Are you ready? How are your things going? How are things going with your company? Just so that you also get to understand what's happening in their lives. Because to be fair, getting a good tenant is quite rare. Some tenants are just sketchy. So if you have a good tenant, they're going to be open with you. And if they say they don't have the money, trust me, they really don't. So you actually what I've noticed is landlords who financed their properties and have good tenants have actually had a great time over this lockdown period, because the interest rates are so low and your rent is still at the same level. So it means that actually your income has actually increased. It may be quite drastic for others. So you've actually been gaining a lot as a landlord. So what I would say is try and find out if they're doing okay. If not, then you can just sit on your own, check your books, see how your cash flow is going. And if you are to actually have a reduction, for your tenant, maybe, just maybe, pass on the reduction you got from the bank to your tenants. It will make life very, very easy for them, because, to be honest, people who own properties and they didn't lose their jobs and they still have their full salaries are actually enjoying these low interests that are happening now. But if you're a tenant, I haven't seen a lot of landlords giving discounts willy-nilly. And I actually commend you for giving out the discount, because even if they don't need it, it actually boosts the relationship that you guys have with them, because at the end of the day, we are all human beings. We connect. And, you know, it's very rare to hear someone say, I like my landlord. The landlord is always this monster, big guy coming in, wants their money. So before we even think of letters of demands and all those stuff, talk to them, find out they're human and they are families. So do that and you'll see it will work out. What I've also seen, especially with our rental portfolio that we're running, I think we collect around 400,000 a month on rental, and with the defaults now, they're less than 10%, and the people who are defaulting don't even reach out. They just hide their heads in the sand. So it's important to be the bigger person and start that conversation. It will actually go a long way.
And, you know, you've actually mentioned such really great nuggets, Nthato, and the core of it, and this is something that so many different guests that we've had in the show always echo, is that property is a relationship business, right? As much as it's a finance business, but it's a relationship business at the core, especially if you're going to be having tenants that need to obviously be managed, whether you're self-managing, whether you've got an agent who's managing your portfolio. This is about relationships and tending to those relationships. And it becomes so important that when you are in the position of relative power in that relationship, that you're proactive. And as you're saying, a lot of landlords, and I know quite a number of landlords who, you know, still enjoy their full salaries, for example, and obviously enjoy the benefit of the lower interest rates. Some of them who haven't passed on that kind of reduction from the get-go, others who didn't throughout. And I saw those very same landlords, you know, essentially complaining that 6 months into lockdown, 8 months into lockdown, then their tenants moved because in the same block there was a property that was cheaper, and so the tenant, the moment it was feasible for them to move and were seeing better movement and that secured that place, they moved. And had they just, you know, tended that relationship, even if you had given a discount for a month, especially for a tenant who didn't even ask for it, you know that your balance sheet can actually afford it. For you, it might probably be, you know, a 500 Rand amount that, when you look at it in the grand scheme of losing a tenant, having to place a new tenant, potentially having your apartment vacant, simply isn't worth it, especially if you know that this is a great tenant that you've had, that has been paying their rental on time, that has been taking care of your place. When you look at the opportunity cost, you realize that actually giving that reduction, whether it's for a year, whether it's for a month or even up to 3 months, is more of an investment than you losing out on that 1,500 Rand in those 3 months. And so I think it's also important that landlords, especially DIY landlords that manage their own portfolios, look at the bigger picture and understand, firstly, how difficult it is to get a really good tenant, and the importance then of building a relationship with your good tenant and checking in on them every so often, especially in the event where, you know, one of my properties is in an area where there was, service delivery protests a couple of months ago during lockdown. And I reached out to the tenant to just find out, are you okay? Are you safe? I'm, seeing all this activity on social media. I wanted to make sure that everything is okay. We've also now received communication from, the managing agent. They're beefing up security, downstairs. So please just be careful of your surroundings. And one could argue, I'm a landlord, you don't need to do that, but it's also understanding that there's a person living in that property whose life is also equally important. So I think on the landlord side, and I want to emphasize this a lot because there are also just landlords who are really not great landlords, and it stresses me out because you in a position to actually be a great landlord. It doesn't cost you extra money to be a decent human being to people who are going to be living in your portfolios. On the other hand, though, Nthato, and I have to put this in because this is also a sentiment I've picked up from landlords, and to a certain degree, there's quite a bit of truth to it. Some of them have said, look, there are tenants who are taking advantage of we'll call it lockdown and the effects of lockdown, and have sometimes whether asked for a rental reduction or have said that they can't make rental. And when I ask for example, supporting documents, whether it's your, for example, your bank statement to illustrate that you do in fact now earn less, then they kind of disappear and they're being sketchy. How do landlords become proactive? And so to be Ubuntu, right, in talking to their tenants, but also still become landlords. And I say become landlords in the context of making sure that they're still ticking their checkbox in when they put all these things in place, making sure that their tenants are potentially not taking them for, taking advantage of them, because we've also seen that, unfortunately. So how can they almost put that into play where they can almost ensure that they're not going to be taken advantage of when it comes to making payment arrangements with their tenants?
Yeah. We spoke earlier about quality tenants, and from our experience in the real estate industry, we've realized that people don't become sketchy overnight. So as a landlord, also check the red flags. If you have tenants who are taking their chances, lying. I mean, to be honest, this lockdown, there are people who are actually losing their livelihoods. There are people who've lost their incomes, their jobs. And you would ask yourself, what type of a human being would actually try and play around with that? You're getting your full salary. You're not being affected. You are actually part of the very, very few people who are actually still getting their salaries. And yet you still want to take advantage of the situation. The best thing that can be done is, as a landlord, what's important is check the properties around you. It's important to check that, are you on par with the current rentals? Because some rentals are just plummeting. Others are just going down a little notch. So from that end, from that point of view, you can have that conversation with your tenant that, listen, I see that within this area, rental has dropped drastically from 6,000 to around 5,000. You've been here a while, so how about we go to around 5,500? Or for the next 24 months, I will not give you any increases. I know our contract says 10%, but you will not get an increase for the next 2 years or even 3, just so that they will also feel that they're being taken care of. Sometimes people also become sketchy because they have checked and they see that, no, man, this guy, I'm actually paying him more than the average, but they are afraid to start the conversation with you. So that could be a part of the reasons that happens. But if genuinely someone's salary has been affected, I also feel like asking for bank statements is a bit of a privacy intrusion. So it may be just a matter of, ask your employer to just write that you've been affected, or, just an email confirming that, no, you indeed have been affected. Because if indeed you've been impacted, there is a formal communication that has been sent to you by the employer saying that, listen, Nthato won't be able to pay your full salaries, will cut down by 20% or 30%. Just forward that, and then they will take that into account. But what we need to understand is that we are going through a crisis, and the majority of the landlords and tenants are not getting any form of help. So basically, we're like on our own. Because if you check in the US now, they're running this rental program for 12 months. You don't pay, and then the state will cover that. We don't have that. Beginning of the lockdown last year, we had conversation about people getting rentals free for 3 months, and also not paying your bond for 3 months. But then when the relief packages came through, we then realized that, hey, this is not what we thought it was going to be. So you find that the majority of people who love their financial sanity ended up not going for those COVID relief packages, because they were just putting you in more and more in debt. So if the landlord doesn't want to be in debt, they don't take it up. That means they're not saving that much. So the only room really that they have to play around with is just interest rates reduction. But not only that, we also understand that there are many dynamics to that. It's a matter of how our property price is doing in the area. It's a matter of the relationship with the tenant. If it's a good, solid tenant that you've had for 5 years and you don't have issues, you need to factor in the cost of fixing your house, the cost of maintaining your house. Great tenants don't even call you when there's a small minor maintenance matter. They just take care of it. When there's a minor plumbing thing, they just take care of it, because they love your house as though it's theirs. So if you have such people in your property, what you want to do is to make their life as simple as you possibly can. And
Mm.
that sometimes may involve you losing a little bit of money. Also check on Lightstone and see how many months the properties in your area stay vacant. So you can also factor that in. If people spend 2 to 3 months without finding a good tenant, you might as well factor that money in and say, listen, I'm willing to write off 3 months and I'm willing to reduce your rent by 1,000. You don't know the impact and effect that would have on that tenant. I mean, you have people renting for 10 years, 15 years. If you have such a solid person and they are paying, that's great. But sometimes there's a scenario where someone is a great tenant, but literally they've been affected. We've seen what's been happening in our countries, and as much as the effects of those haven't gotten into society yet, but we know it's always a domino effect. This happens, and then later on, some people are going to be laid off. Some people aren't going to get their salaries for this month. You have a solid tenant who does not have much savings. We understand the situation in South Africa. Some people just don't have the savings. It's okay to have that conversation and say, listen, I can give you a month or 2 off, and you see on your side how you'll cover up, because this person genuinely did not get a salary. So they didn't become a bad person overnight. So also, be open-minded and realize that at the end of the day, we connect as human beings, not in a position of power or anything like that. It's just 2 human beings connecting. But also, speaking of relationships with our tenants and landlords, as a landlord, have boundaries. Yes, it's good to have a relationship, but this person is not your friend, because once that happens, then they're going to just send you a random text at 11 p.m. and say, listen, I don't have rent, show me. You don't want that. So when it comes to money, I'm very strict, but we can connect afterwards, no problem.
I like that. When it comes to money, you're very strict. I think it actually just raises the question of having very good money boundaries, regardless of the tenant-landlord relationship, but across different relationships. And that's probably a topic for, a whole different topic for a different show altogether. Now, Nthato, when you look on the tenant side, how can tenants be proactive? And I ask this in light of us having spoken about the power dynamic between the tenant and the landlord, and how, for the most part, really the landlord is the one fundamentally who has more power, and oftentimes tenants tend to also not know a lot of their rights when it comes to what they can or cannot do in the context of their relationship with their landlord, and we mean the legal relationship. So how can they be proactive, especially tenants who can already somewhat foresee that, look, things and look, it's going to be rough for the next couple of days, certainly for this month, because sometimes, in as much as you as the tenant may not have been affected, perhaps your where you work was closed, but your pay won't be affected. You have very close relatives who are affected, where you may have to send money to them for this, particularly for this month. I want to almost isolate it a bit, because I know there are different things tenants can do to be proactive for a longer period. But when we're looking at what's happening this month and how things keep being stacked up on top of each other, and it's only the 13th, there's no telling what it's going to be like come Friday, or certainly by this time next week. How can a tenant then be proactive in raising that conversation with their landlord?
Yeah, I think there's 2 dynamics to this question. The first is, it's way easier for tenants who have a direct relationship with the landlord.
Yes.
Then we have the majority of the tenants who there is a buffer between them. This is the managing agent. Mostly these are us. And the managing agents are quite strict because they have a fiduciary responsibility to the landlord. So, and the landlords also, they are very strict when it comes to the agent. So whoever feels the pressure, they then pass it on to the next person. So the landlord pressurizes the agent for their money. The agent will pressurize with the tenant for their money, because they are getting paid for it. It's your job. Some landlords will say, why am I paying you? Because exactly, you're not collecting.
I know we do say that, right? We do. Yeah.
I'm used to that line. So now, with that happening, you need to check the dynamics. If you have a direct relationship to the landlord, it's much easier for you to reach out to them and say, listen, I foresee having an issue this month. Is there a way that we can work about this? But the best way also would be, as you reach out, also put a suggestion on the table, because sometimes what you are saying may be interpreted as you saying, I don't want to pay rent. So the easiest thing to say is, listen, I'm having some financial difficulties. You don't even have to give details that, listen, Uma needs an extra 2,000 this month. It's just personal financial difficulties. I will not be able to make rent this month. So I would suggest that for the entire year, this 5,000 that I'm missing, I would like to pay 500 for the next 10 months on top of my normal rental. I think I will afford this. Can I do that? Most landlords would understand. In fact, they'd be happy, because I've never seen a landlord tell someone to vacate their property because they missed 1 month. They understand the dynamics, and also they know.
And they also legally can't tell you that. We must also put that they legally can't tell you that either, right? As much as Nthato's never seen it, your landlord, you miss 1 month, they can't tell you must vacate. There are processes before we get there. So that will always emphasize, because we've seen way too many landlords use all kinds of illegal activity to get tenants out of properties. So that's also a thing that tenants need to be quite aware of.
Yeah, and lovely point, because it's important as a tenant. Your Bible as a tenant is the Rental Housing Act. If you're a tenant and you've never read this, I would highly suggest that you read that, familiarize yourself with your rights, and also just so that you know how protected you are, because it's not just the rights, it's also responsibilities. What are you responsible to do? Because you are using someone's property and you promised to make a certain payment. So you must also honor that. But also importantly, our country has laws and principles that need to be followed. So in terms of you being told to vacate, something needs to happen, a lengthy, expensive process, but it needs to be undertaken, which is unfortunate for the landlords. But given what we've seen happening in the country in the previous years, then we know that has to happen. But if you have to go through the agent, just let the agent know exactly what is happening, because unfortunately with agents, because they're the middlemen, they are going to want to know the details. They're going to need the evidence so that they will present your case to the landlord. Remember now, it's now twofold, because this agent is also trying to save themselves. They've been hired. Their primary purpose is for them to skin you, to manage you, and collect rental. So immediately when that doesn't happen, then feathers are going to be ruffled. So have that conversation with the agent much earlier on. In fact, it's much better for you to have the conversation and say, listen, I see a storm coming, but I'm still fine. Because 5 months later, when you come back and say, by the way, that storm I told you about, it has landed, it's a much easier conversation, because I warned you, I told you what's going to happen, and I've also shown you that I'm willing to go the extra length in meeting my payments, but now I'm stuck in this situation and something needs to happen. Unfortunately, there's no easy way around it. When someone does not have the money to pay, there's no payment that you're going to receive as a landlord. And we also like to advise people a lot that you need to have at least 3 months saved of your payments for your bond as a landlord, so that when an eventuality happens, which happens most of the time, you know that you are protected. The last thing you want is to be telling tenants that you're going to lose your house.
And the reality, Nthato, before we wrap, the reality, unfortunately, is that the majority of landlords, and we're talking obviously residential landlords, simply do not have that buffer, right? The majority of landlords are also living paycheck to paycheck like their tenants. Very few of them don't even have an emergency fund to deal with maintenance issues of their respective properties. Never mind dealing with the the bond repayment for a 3-month period, and that's something that's also just quite alarming, right? That as landlords, you're also living on the edge like that, and you haven't put in adequate buffers to afford that property and budget for an event of an emergency, especially when we look at the relative high vacancy rates that we get. And this is across different types of properties. And so if you're going to be going into that space, you also need to account for vacancy rates and budget for them effectively. I've seen way too many landlords not do that and not do that well. And it does end up eating into how it has an effect on how you manage your portfolio. And I think this is what people don't realize, that when you know that you haven't properly budgeted, but also put systems in place for instances of crisis, the way that you then go about managing your property is affected, because you're no longer looking at it as, this is a business where you've put in, various systems in place in the event that something goes wrong, but you're now making an emotional decision in managing your portfolio. And it's a very dangerous thing, and obviously very stressful, because I can imagine just the stress of then not having a tenant, or not having a tenant who's paying on time, and then having to essentially deal with that. Nthato, before we wrap up, any final tips for both the landlord and the tenant when it comes to rental relief, particularly for this month? I mean, I know we're still going to explore this topic very likely next week, and even look at then legally what should you be getting in place, especially once you actually know you're not going to be able to afford it. Any changes that an addendum rather that you want to add to your to your lease agreement when it comes to even that payment plan. So beyond having the conversation and the email, actually writing down that contract and putting it in place, because we're very big on making sure that everything is still documented, and this is for the benefit of both parties, right? Not just the landlord, not just the tenant, but it's important for both parties that all kinds of communications and resolutions around payment are made in writing and signed, because then it's a legally binding document. But any final tips for both sides when it comes to rental relief, particularly for the month of July, well, for the month of August, as we pay rent in advance?
Definitely. I think what I'd like to highlight is, as we give some relief to our tenants, very much importantly to the landlords, the deposit is not meant for rental. I've seen so many cases where landlords dip into the deposit to make up for missed rentals. Guys, the deposit is there, and it needs to be saved in a separate account. You know the rules, so don't even think of the deposit. Deposit should be safeguarded, and it's also not an emergency fund for the landlord. Having said that, have the conversation, see what is happening. Also, read the room of the country. Things aren't going well now, and you understand. Just make sure that you see the financial circumstances of your tenant. If indeed you can afford to give them a month off, do that. If you can afford to say pay half, do that just for this month, because we understand what is happening. In the long term, I can assure you it is going to do much, much better for you, because as human beings, we also have that sense of indebtedness that, hey, Zama came through for me when I needed her the most. So even though there's a house that's cheaper down the road, I will not leave Zama and go to that house. I will stay here, because I know when things get bad, Zama has got my back.
And that's such a great note to leave it on, Nthato, that more than anything, we need to read the room. There's quite a lot happening right now. We're all, individually and collectively going through quite a lot as we're, consuming everything from, the news, social media, the WhatsApp groups, WhatsApp statuses, and it's so important for both parties, but particularly landlords, to be able to not be tone deaf to what's happening in the country. And in the event where your tenant is approaching you, be mindful of everything that you're seeing, be mindful of all the activity that we're essentially seeing in the country, and meet that person with the kind of grace and dignity that you would want afforded to you in the event where you're in a difficult position. Because the reality is nobody wants to approach, particularly a landlord, to say, I don't have enough money. Nobody wants to have that conversation. I think it's difficult enough, us collectively going through what we're going through. You also don't want to have to go to somebody to say, Amna Mali, I can't pay rent, can I pay just a little bit? Nobody wants to have that conversation for the most part. So be mindful of what's happening and meet people with the dignity and the grace that you'd want extended to you if you were in a similar position. Nthato, we're going to leave it there this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Zama.
And that is Nthato Raboshaga, who is the founder at Nthato Realty. And that brings us to the end of the Private Property Podcast with myself, Uzamantomwa Khumalo. And I think on a final note, the next couple of days are very likely going to even be heavier for many of us as you're processing potentially, loss of loved ones. COVID-19 is still very much here, and we're seeing the devastating effects that is having on all of us in all our respective households. I think it's just so important that all of us are not just careful in terms of how we talk to each other, but also in what we are sharing on social media, and meeting each other really with the dignity, as I was saying to Nthato, that we want to be met with, because there's a lot happening individually and collectively. And I think this is that time where we want to, as much as possible, not cause harm to each other and also not cause harm to ourselves. I think if you can feel that things are getting overwhelming, get out of social media, especially the social media space, because I also know many of us spend quite a significant amount of time consuming part of that. And I'll leave it there this evening. And as usual, you can look forward to Umbalinoko on the Farming Podcast that's coming to your screens at 8 p.m. I'll be back on your screens tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Until then, hoping you're staying home and staying safe.